Was Jesus a real historical person? Was he just a very famous mythical figure? Was there really a man who walked on this earth called Jesus? Well, let us find out. Sources about the life of Jesus can be divided into two major groups. They are non-Christian and Christian sources. The non-Christian sources include the Roman and the Jewish sources. About AD 112, Pliny wrote a letter to the Emperor Trajan telling him how he dealt with Christians. This is the course that I have adopted in the case of those brought before me as Christians. If they admit it, I repeat the question a second time, threatening capital punishment. If they persist, I sentence them to death, but they declared that the sum of their guilt or error has amounted only to this, that on an appointed day they had been accustomed to meet before daybreak, and recite a hymn antiphonally to Christ, as to a God, and to bind themselves from any crime but to abstain from theft, robbery, adultery and breach of faith, and not to deny a deposit when it was claimed. We see that in this quotation Pliny the Younger mentions Christ being worshipped as a god by Christians. Tacitus wrote the history of the Roman Empire that covered the years d. 14 to 68. Here is a quote from his book that mentions Christ and Christians. Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. Christus, from whom their name is derived, had suffered the death penalty in the reign of Tiberius by the sentence of the procurator Pontius Pilate, and a most mischievous superstition was checked for a moment, only to break out once more, not merely in Judea, the home of the disease, but even in Rome, the capital itself. End quote. In the quotation, Tacitus mentions Christus is under the death penalty of Pontius Pilate during the reign of Tiberius Caesar in relation to Nero's burning of Rome, and accusing and persecuting Christians as the culprits responsible. Suetonius compiled a series of biographies of the first 12 emperors of Rome, beginning with Julius Caesar, titled Lives of the 12 Caesars, which was written in 120 AD. Regarding the reign of Claudius, he wrote about the expulsion of Jews from Rome because of possible quarrels between Jews and Christians over Christus. The quote says, "Since the Jews were continually making disturbances at the instigation of Christus, he, Claudius, expelled him from Rome." It is important to note that most scholars believe that Suetonius misspelled the name of Christ, writing Christus instead of Christus. In addition, they agree that he misunderstood the event, for the conflicts were not caused directly by Christ in person, but they arose because of the differing views about him. The Jewish sources. Born to a Jewish priestly family, Joseph was the son of Matthias and became a Pharisee after studying the beliefs of the main Jewish sects. He was placed in charge of the defense of Galilee during the Jewish revolt against Rome at the age of 29. Though Joseph had prepared the defenses against the Roman attack, he was not very successful. In 67 AD, most of Galilee was already defeated by the Romans, and only the Jewish fortress of Jotapata was left. After a siege of this fortress that lasted 47 days, the Romans defeated it and Joseph fled the city. Hiding in a cave with some 40 other Jews, he was discovered. Though most of the other Jews had decided to commit suicide rather than surrender to the Romans, Joseph escaped the mass suicide by trickery. He and another survivor surrendered to the Romans. Upon meeting the Roman Emperor Vespasian, Joseph greeted him, Caesar, and predicted that he, Vespasian, and his son, Titus, would become emperors of Rome. After a chaotic period following the reigns of Nero, Galba, Otho and Vitellius, Vespasian and his son after him became emperors of Rome just as Joseph has predicted. As a result, Joseph was freed, became part of the emperor's court, and changed his name to Flavius, the family name of Vespasian and Titus. During the siege of Jerusalem, Josephus served as translator and interpreter for Titus and an apologist for Rome, a defender of Rome. After the war and destruction of Jerusalem, Josephus went back to Rome with Titus and wrote a number of books, which had made him a noted Jewish historian of the 1st century AD. In one of his famous books, there are two noted quotes that make mention of Jesus. In Antiquities of the Jews it said, "About this time there lived Jesus, a wise man, if indeed one ought to call him a man. For he was one who wrought surprising feats and was a teacher of such people as accept the truth gladly. He won over many Jews and many of the Greeks. He was the Messiah, Christ. When Pilate, upon hearing him accused by men of the highest standing among us, had condemned him to be crucified, those who had in the first place come to love him did not give up their affection for him. On the third day he appeared to them restored to life, for the prophets of God had prophesied these and countless other marvelous things about him. And the tribe of Christians, so called after him, has still to this day not disappeared." In that same book it also said, possessed of such a character, Ananus, the high priest, thought that he had a favorable opportunity because Festus was dead and Albinus was still on the way. Festus and Albinus were Roman governors. And so he convened the judges of the Sanhedrin and brought before them a man named James, the brother of Jesus, who was called the Messiah, Christ, and certain others. He accused him of having transgressed the law and delivered him up to be stoned. Comments on Josephus and his writings about Jesus. Quote number 1, the truthfulness and authenticity of the first quote above has drawn questions from scholars and has led some to believe that some of the statements have been inserted by Christian copyists to make it suitable for the Christian faith. Some of these sentences in the quote which a true Jew would not write include, if indeed one ought to call him a man. He was the Messiah, Christ. On the third day he appeared to them restored to life, for the prophets of God had prophesied these and countless other marvelous things about him. Apart from these statements, Josephus confirms key points about Jesus in agreement with the Bible's Gospels. Jesus was a wise teacher who had a large following and was crucified by Pilate through the accusation of the Jewish leaders. Quote 2, in the second quote, Josephus mentioned how Ananias the high priest took advantage of the death of the Roman governor, Festus, to execute James the brother of Jesus. So we can say that his writings and mentions of Jesus can be considered reliable and of great importance in proving the historicity of Jesus. The Talmud is a very important rabbinic writing among the Jews. It was made up of two parts, the Mishnah and the Gemara. The Mishnah, written in Hebrew language, is made up of oral traditions in Judaism from about 200 BC to 200 AD, also known as the tradition of the elders, Mark chapter 7 verses 1 to 13. The Gemara, written in Aramaic, is made up of various commentaries about the Mishnah. While a Gemara from Palestine, or Jerusalem, combined with the Mishnah, between 350 and 400 AD, became known as the Palestinian Talmud, a Gemara from Babylon combined with the Mishnah, in 500 AD, became known as the Babylonian Talmud. It is in this rabbinic writing that some mentions and allusions are made to the life of Jesus. One very prominent and clear quote from this Jewish rabbinic source is, on the eve of Passover, Yeshu was hanged. For 40 days before the execution took place, a herald went forth and cried, he is going forth to be stoned because he has practiced sorcery and enticed Israel to apostasy. Anyone who can say anything in his favor, let him come forward and plead on his behalf. But since nothing was brought forward in his favor, he was hanged on the eve of the Passover. Our rabbis taught, Yeshu had 5 disciples, Mattai, Nakai, Nezer, Buni and Toda. On the eve of Passover, Yeshu was hanged. For 40 days before the execution took place, a herald went forth and cried, he is going forth to be stoned because he has practiced sorcery and enticed Israel to apostasy. Anyone who can say anything in his favor, let him come forward and plead on his behalf. But since nothing was brought forward in his favor, he was hanged on the eve of the Passover. Our rabbis taught, Yeshu had 5 disciples, Mattai, Nakai, Nezer, Buni and Toda. Therefore, many of these other quotes imply that Jesus was born out of an immoral relationship between Mary and a Roman soldier, called Panthera, was a false messiah who practiced magic and was condemned to death. Strobel, 86. However, these quotes indirectly suggest that there was something unusual about the birth of Jesus and that his life was one of supernatural events. This quote from Professor M. Wilcox presents the importance of these quotes from the Babylonian Talmud, the Jewish traditional literature, although it mentions Jesus only quite sparingly, and must in any case be used with caution, supports the gospel claim that he was a healer and miracle worker, even though it ascribes these activities to sorcery. In addition, it preserves the recollection that he was a teacher, and that he had disciples, 5 of them, and that at least in the earlier rabbinic period not all of the sages had finally made up their minds that he was a heretic or a deceiver. The Christian sources include the non-canonical Gospels and the biblical canonical sources. These are Gospels that are not included in the books of the Bible and are mostly referred to by Christians as apocryphal writings. They are not considered by Christians as inspired by God and not regarded as scripture. Some examples of these include the following. 1. Infancy Gospels, narrates details of Jesus' life as a young child. The Infancy Gospel of Thomas, the Infancy Gospel of James. 2. Sayings Gospels, narrates teachings and sayings of Jesus. The Gospel of Thomas, the Apocryphon of James, the Dialogue of the Savior. 3. Cross, Passion Gospels, narrates events which happened during the death and resurrection. The Acts of Pilate, the Gospel of Peter. 4. Post-resurrection Dialogue Gospels, narrates dialogues Jesus had with different individuals after his resurrection. The Gospel of Mary, the Epistula Apostolorum. Other apocryphal Gospels include Gospel of Barnabas, Gospel of the Ebionites and Secret Gospel of Mark. Most of these apocryphal Gospels originated from the middle of the 2nd century, 101 to 200 AD, and many of them claim to be written by the apostles, which is surely false based on their content and context. Though these writings can provide some information for the study of the early Christian church between the 2nd and 4th century AD, their value for the study of the life of Jesus is debated. While many of these Gospels contain imaginary stories and questionable historic authenticity, one apocryphal Gospel has drawn much scholarly attention for its similarity to the sayings of Jesus in the Gospels. The Gospel of Thomas is a Coptic collection of 114 sayings discovered among many manuscripts in 1945 at Nag Hammadi in Egypt. While the Coptic manuscript dates back to circa 400, the Greek papyri fragments date back to circa 200. There is a general agreement among scholars that the sayings in the Gospel of Thomas were not taken from the biblical Gospels but from separate traditions of the sayings of Jesus that were either oral or written. If this is true, then this apocryphal Gospel stands as an independent witness to the truthfulness of the biblical Gospels. Some quotations from the Gospel of Thomas that are similar to Jesus' sayings in the Gospels. Jesus said, "You see the speck that is in your brother's eye, but you do not see the log which is in your own eye. When you take the log out of your own eye, then you will see to take out the speck from your brother's eye." Number 26, Matthew chapter 7 verses 3 to 5. Jesus said, "No prophet is acceptable in his village. No physician works cures on those who know him." Number 31, cf. Matthew chapter 13 verse 57, Luke chapter 4 verse 24. Jesus said, "It is impossible for a man to ride 2 horses, and to stretch 2 bows, and it is impossible for a servant to serve 2 masters. Either he will honor the one and despise the other." Number 47, Matthew chapter 6 verse 24. If this apocryphal Gospel is truly an independent work from the biblical Gospel, then it stands as a very reliable historical confirmation for the historical reality of Jesus outside the Bible and the Gospels. These sources are found in the Bible and include mainly the 4 New Testament Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, and the epistles of Paul, Pauline epistles, along with the rest of the New Testament books. Apart from the Gospels, there is very limited information in the rest of the New Testament about the life of Jesus Christ.